It was a chilly autumn morning when Lucas, with a backpack heavier than usual, crossed through the gates of his new school. The old building, with its worn-out bricks and broken windows, seemed to have more history than he wanted. He felt a mix of anxiety and unease, as if the air around him was thick with the untold secrets of the place. Lucas had recently moved, forced to leave his hometown and start over in a distant neighborhood, where the only thing that felt familiar was how completely his life had been turned upside down. The school, an old educational institution, was surrounded by rumors and stories that circulated among the locals. They said it had once been a prestigious school, but over time, many of the children had disappeared, and with them, the school's reputation had faded. Now, only the most troubled students and those like him, with no other options, were there. As he entered through the main gate, Lucas couldn't help but notice the peculiar architecture of the school. The main building was enormous, with long, labyrinthine hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly beyond what he could see. The walls, made of weathered brick, were covered with a thin layer of moss, giving the place a sense of abandonment, as if time had stopped there. Most of the students seemed absorbed, heads down, as if the shadows that lingered throughout the school had a hypnotic power over them. He was led to the principal's office, where the receptionist, a woman with gray hair and a tired look in her eyes, handed him the school map. "Here are the schedules and rooms," she said in a monotone voice, then left him alone, as if she was used to seeing new students vanish into the abyss of that school. Lucas studied the map carefully, trying to memorize the room numbers and the shortest paths. But something caught his attention. In the lower right corner, there was a marking for a room 404. Strangely, it wasn't listed as part of the regular school circuit. There was no information about what happened there or what kind of class was held. Intrigued, Lucas decided he would look for that room later, even though a chill ran down his spine every time he glanced at the number 404. There was something about that number that felt wrong, like a warning disguised as a riddle. Throughout the day, he started getting used to the other students, but there was something off about them. Their expressions were blank, their gazes fixed and lifeless. The classroom was cold, and the teacher, a woman with a disheveled appearance, seemed to be talking more to herself than to the students. Even so, everyone else seemed hypnotized, as if they were trapped in a routine that kept them there, not questioning a thing. The air felt heavy, filled with a quiet tension. But by the end of the day, Lucas couldn't shake his curiosity. He grabbed his map and started searching for that hallway. He knew that if he didn't go now, he'd never have the courage to try again. The day was coming to an end, and the last lessons were being given, but Lucas couldn't focus. His restless gaze wandered around the room, while the teacher spoke nonstop, as if she were in a trance. His mind was completely preoccupied with what he would find when he left that place. He waited until the other students had left, hurried off to their next classes or extracurricular activities. When the room cleared out, Lucas grabbed his map again, studying the location of room 404. The school was empty and silent, the sound of his own footsteps echoing through the deserted hallways. He followed the path marked on the map, passing through endless corridors whose walls seemed to subtly shift as he moved forward. The atmosphere was freezing, a cold that seemed to seep into his skin, and the more he walked, the deeper the silence surrounded him, like a heavy cloak. Soon, he found himself in front of a door that seemed out of place in time. It wasn't marked on the map, and there was no indication of its purpose. The corridor around it was lit only by a weak lamp that flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows on the walls. The door was made of dark wood, with a thin layer of dust that suggested it wasn't open frequently. Lucas hesitated. A gut feeling urged him to turn back to the familiar path, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He reached out and touched the cold doorknob, and with a slight push, the door creaked open. Inside, the room was in total silence. There was no noise, not even the usual sounds of a classroom. No laughter, no conversations, not even the sound of chalk on the board. The room seemed to be in perfect condition, but there was something unsettling about the air. The place was old with rusted furniture, and the smell of dust filled the space. Lucas stepped inside, looking around. There were several desks, all arranged neatly but empty. At the back of the room, a dusty window let in a faint light from outside, but it was as if the light was somehow isolated, not touching the rest of the room. Then he noticed it. It wasn't just furniture in there. There were students, too. They were sitting at the desks, but their bodies seemed stiff, as if they were in a deep sleep. They didn't move, but their eyes, though half closed, were fixed on Lucas. Their gazes were empty, as if they were watching without really seeing, yet still aware of his presence. The heavy silence that enveloped the room made the situation even more unsettling. Lucas stood frozen for a moment, unable to look away from the motionless students. The sense of unease grew inside him, and a shiver ran down his spine. Something was wrong here. He took a hesitant step toward one of the desks, and as he got closer, he noticed that the nearest student seemed a little different. He wore an old-fashioned school uniform, with details from a time Lucas didn't recognize. His hands were stretched out over the desk, as if waiting for something or someone. Lucas swallowed hard and, almost unwillingly, asked in a low voice, "Are you okay?" No one responded. No movement. Nothing but the silence. However, at one point, one of the students, still staring at Lucas, tilted his head slightly to the side. It was the only gesture. Lucas' heart raced, and he took a step back, unable to tear his eyes away from the room, now filled with an invisible tension that seemed to choke his breath. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. These aren't regular students. But before he could process any more, the door behind him slammed shut with a sharp thud, and he was hit with an intense chill that made him break out in a cold sweat. Whatever was happening in that room wasn't natural. He could feel it in his bones. Something was waiting for him. Something was about to happen. Lucas stood there, frozen in the center of the room, not knowing what to do. The silence dragged on, growing heavier with every passing second. The cold air seemed to wrap around his lungs, making it harder to breathe. He looked at the students, still motionless, and something deeply disturbing occurred to him. They didn't seem alive. He didn't know what made him feel this so clearly. Was it the vacant stares on their pale faces, the stillness of their bodies, or maybe the fact that he had never heard anyone at the school mention a class in this room? His eyes moved from one face to another, trying to understand what was going on. But the longer he looked, the more a sense of dread filled him. He had the distinct feeling he was being watched by something that shouldn't be there, something beyond his understanding. One of the students, a girl with long hair and a neutral expression, seemed even more distant than the others. She was seated at the front of the room, but her eyes were slightly open, locked on Lucas with an unsettling intensity. The way she stared at him made him feel like he was being examined, studied like an insect under a magnifying glass. He took a step back, searching for some logical explanation, but everything around him felt so unreal that fear overtook his mind. It wasn't possible. He wasn't dreaming, but nothing made sense. The room was too cold, the silence too deep, and those students, no, they couldn't be human. Lucas looked again at the expressionless faces. Their eyes, empty and fixed, were like mirrors, reflecting nothing but a malevolent presence that he couldn't grasp. Time seemed to slow down in there. His feet moved automatically as he tried to find some sign of life. But as he approached one of the students' desks, an eerie sensation paralyzed him. The girl with the fixed stare was no longer in her chair. She had risen silently, and was now just a few steps away from him. Her empty gaze was still fixed on Lucas, but her body was stiffer than ever, as if she were a wind-up doll about to be pulled. A shiver ran down his spine, and his feet moved toward the door, but his eyes remained glued to her figure. He barely had time to react before she spoke. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, as if she were trying to say words that were never meant to be spoken again. "You shouldn't be here," she said, the phrase dragging in the cold air. "They don't like those who come." Lucas took a step back, but his feet dragged, as if the floor was sticking to the soles of his shoes. The other students, now starting to move slowly, watched him with disturbing attention. Time seemed to distort as his eyes moved from one face to another. Those students weren't ordinary people. They were dead, or something worse. He tried to remember how he got there, how he could have gotten lost in that dark corridor. But the door, which now seemed far too distant, was locked. The walls of the room seemed to close in around him, making the space more and more claustrophobic. There was no way out, and the presence of those students, who once seemed so harmless, now felt like a palpable threat. Each of them seemed in a trance, but their eyes followed Lucas as if they were waiting for something he didn't want to give. The girl who had spoken to him stepped closer, her step slow, but her intent clear. When she reached the minimum distance, she whispered again, "You will be one of them." Those words echoed in Lucas' mind like a blow. He didn't know what they meant, but he could feel that something truly terrible was about to happen. He shouldn't have been there, and now there was no way to escape. The other students began to move, each with a strange, inhuman rhythm. They didn't speak, but the charged atmosphere conveyed a clear message. The room was alive, and they were its trapped souls, waiting for someone new to take the place of one of them. The air was heavy with mounting pressure, and Lucas knew, deep inside, that he might be the next victim. There was no doubt. The room was keeping him there, and the key to escaping seemed to be in the hands of those who were waiting. But he didn't know how to play their game. Desperate, he searched for an exit, but the door that once seemed normal was now covered by a thick layer of darkness, as if it had been swallowed by time itself. He was trapped, not just physically but spiritually, in a place where death and life blurred together. The fear was so thick it felt like a weight pressing against Lucas' chest, making it hard for him to breathe. Each of the students in the room seemed closer, more real, yet at the same time more distorted. Their fixed, lifeless eyes watched him as though they were waiting for a reaction, a response. The room now felt cramped, the walls closing in as the students moved slower, with a rhythm that didn't resemble anything human. Lucas didn't know what to do. His mind was in shambles, trying to process what was happening. He glanced at the door again, but it was now covered in an opaque darkness, with no sign of light or hope. There was no escape, no clear way out of this room that now felt like a prison. The girl who had warned him, with her pale face and distant expression, began to walk in circles around him, her shadow flickering on the walls like a specter. Her steps were odd, out of sync, as if they no longer obeyed the laws of physics. Her mouth moved once more, and this time her words slithered out in a near-hissing whisper. "You think you can just leave, huh?" Her voice didn't come from where she was physically. It was as if it echoed from every direction, intensifying the feeling of being watched. Lucas felt a wave of panic rise within him. But what terrified him the most was that he couldn't understand what she meant by those words. What did they want from him? And what would he have to do to get out of there? Before he could process more, another student stood up, a tall boy with a disturbingly empty gaze. He walked toward Lucas without saying a word, his steps slow and deliberate. When he was only a few inches away, he leaned in and, in a soft, almost imperceptible voice, spoke. "It's time to play the game." Lucas' heart raced. "What game?" he whispered, trying to sound calm, but his words were thick with desperation. But the boy only smiled, a cold smile, devoid of any emotion. The other students began to move too. The room that had once seemed desolate and cold was now alive with a strange, macabre motion. Lucas felt surrounded, their vacant eyes so close that he could almost feel the pressure of their gaze on his skin. The girl he'd spoken to stepped forward and locked eyes with him. The game of souls. If you lose, you'll be one of us. The air crackled with a strange electricity, as if the very boundaries of reality were starting to break apart. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding fast as the students closed in around him, forming a tight circle. There was no room to run. The boy who had approached earlier reached out his hand toward Lucas as if offering something, but what he held wasn't tangible. It was a feeling, an invisible pressure that seemed to grow with each passing second. "Choose your path," the boy said, now with a deeper tone, almost ritualistic. "If you don't make the right choice, you'll take the place of one of us. And who knows what happens then?" The room was engulfed in growing darkness. The faces of the students seemed to dissolve, transforming into blurred shadows as their words echoed in Lucas' mind. What was he supposed to do? How could he escape this insidious trap? The boy's words were etched into his mind, repeating like a torturous echo. The right path, the right choice. But what was it? Lucas felt a wave of anguish wash over him, mixed with a desperate curiosity. He didn't know what the students wanted from him, or how he had ended up in this nightmare. The only thought dominating his mind was that he needed to do something. But what? The room seemed to grow darker by the second, the students' faces becoming a mist of distorted shadows. He felt as though he was at the center of something much bigger, something beyond his control. But there was no time left to hesitate. With a surge of impulse, Lucas made a choice. He pointed to the girl who had warned him. She was the only one he felt he could trust, or at least the only one who might offer some hope of an answer. "You," Lucas shouted, his voice trembling. "You said I shouldn't be here. Tell me how to get out of here." Silence fell over the room, and all eyes fixed on him. The girl simply smiled, a smile that was neither kind nor cruel, but empty, an expression that conveyed no emotion, yet still seemed to carry a sinister depth. "You've already made your choice, Lucas," she said, her voice soft, almost sweet. "Now, it's time to discover the price." With those words, the game was in motion. Lucas' future was now intertwined with the decision he had just made. He had chosen a side, but the students were already moving toward him, their hands outstretched, ready to take what they wanted. Lucas didn't know what awaited him, but one thing was certain. He was in a nightmare from which he wouldn't be waking up so easily. The room seemed to be closing in around him, like an invisible cage, and his feet were stuck to the floor. The air was heavy, as though each breath was pulling him deeper into that unknown and terrifying place. When he looked at the girl he had chosen, her smile still remained, not a friendly smile, but one that seemed to melt his hope with every passing second. She didn't seem worried. To her, this was just part of the game. But Lucas didn't know the rules. He didn't know how to escape this nightmare, nor what he would have to sacrifice to do so. The girl extended her hand, and her pale fingers seemed to glow in the dim light of the room. What was she offering? He had no idea, but a part of him felt that this decision would change everything. The idea of giving up, surrendering, becoming one of them, terrified him more than anything else. But he couldn't keep going without understanding what was happening. "You have no choice," she said, with an unsettling softness. "We're all stuck here, and we're all waiting for someone who can take our place." She paused, as if deliberating on what to say next. The silence was heavy, suffocated by a growing tension, as if the very air was about to explode. "Each of us lives a lie," she continued. "We were all caught here, in some way. And now you, Lucas, you're about to discover what it means to be part of this endless cycle." Lucas looked around, trying to find any sign of a possible escape, but it was impossible. He was surrounded by those pale faces and empty eyes, all waiting for him to do something, anything, to escape his own damnation. But at the same time, he felt that any wrong move would trap him even more. He could feel the weight of each stare, the pressure of every presence. You want me to take one of your places?" Lucas asked, his voice faltering. He couldn't believe the question he was asking, but the words came out as if they were being forced from his throat. The girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at the other students, as if waiting for something. Then, as if in unison, all the other students began to move. Their bodies, once still, now came to life, but in a strange and unsettling way. They slowly approached, their steps dragging, as if time itself were moving with them. "It's not that simple, Lucas," said another student, a boy with pale skin and half-closed eyes. His voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking through a veil of ice. "It's not about replacing someone, but about becoming one of us." Lucas tried to take a step back, but his legs felt heavy, as if the ground itself were glued to his feet. He was paralyzed by fear and the growing sensation that with every move he made, he was sinking deeper into the darkness. He could no longer distinguish whether the other students were human or not. Time seemed to stretch and shrink at the same time, and he no longer knew what was real. The girl with the empty smile stepped forward. She stared at him, her eyes piercing into his soul, and then whispered, "You're already here, Lucas, and you've already made your choice. Now, you need to pay the price." Before he could respond, the walls of the room began to distort. The light around him flickered, as if reality itself were crumbling. The figures around him started dissolving into shadows, but the voices continued echoing in his mind, like an endless repetition of disjointed words. We are like you now. Lost. But you are the key." Lucas felt a rising panic. He didn't know what it meant to be the key. He didn't understand how he could be the solution or the cause of something so horrible. But he was starting to realize that the rules of this room, of this macabre game, were not the same as the ones he knew. He had no control. He was there, in this nightmare, unable to escape, trapped in a web of lost souls and unfulfilled promises. The room was now completely dark, with only a faint bluish light illuminating the distorted faces around him. The shadows seemed to swallow everything, growing thicker, more present, until reality completely transformed. He was no longer just in an old classroom. He was inside a nightmare, and the lines between life and death were blurred. Lucas no longer knew who to trust or what to expect. He had already made his choice, but now the real question was, what price would he have to pay for it? What remained of Lucas was a torn version of himself. The darkness surrounding the room was no longer just a physical shadow. It seemed to seep into his mind, twisting his thoughts and swallowing his sanity. He could hear his own breaths, fast and shallow, as if he were drowning. Each step he took felt like walking on crumbling ground, a nightmare pulling him deeper with every second. The girl with the empty smile was right in front of him now, her presence almost omnipresent, as if her essence was spreading across the walls, the air, every shadow. The pressure increased, suffocating Lucas, and he felt the need to ask, even though he knew the answer could be more horrifying than he could understand. "How do I get out?" His voice sounded weaker than he would have liked to admit. He wanted to believe there was a way, a clue to escape, but her words echoed in his mind. "You've already made your choice." The girl shook her head slowly, her expression growing more cruel, as if watching prey struggle in a trap. "You don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice seeming to resonate directly in his mind. "I think the truth needs to be revealed. This place, it doesn't allow you to leave once the choice has been made." With those words, the room around Lucas began to change once again. The bluish light that had once illuminated the distorted faces now turned red, and the pressure on his chest increased, as if something were tightening around him. He looked at the other students. Their expressions were no longer just empty, but now intense, ravenous. They were slowly approaching him, as if waiting for him to make a move. But he dared not move. Fear paralyzed him, and his mind desperately tried to find a way to understand what was happening. "What do you want from me?" Lucas whispered, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and confusion. "What am I to you?" The students didn't respond. Instead, they began to form a circle around him, all silent, their shadows stretching in ways that seemed to merge, creating an invisible prison. Then, finally, the girl spoke, but her voice no longer sounded human. It was like a distant echo, as if coming from a place beyond reality. "You're already one of us, Lucas. Don't you realize it yet?" she said, her voice dragging like a chain. "This room is a limbo, a place where lost souls are trapped between life and death. The only way to escape is to make someone take your place, but you've already done that. You entered this cycle, and now there's no way out." The revelation fell on him like a heavy weight. He understood what she meant, but at the same time, he couldn't accept it. He didn't want to be one of those lost souls, one of those shadows. He didn't want to live in limbo, trapped between the real and the unreal, between life and death. "No!" Lucas screamed, now in greater desperation. "I don't want to be one of them. I won't take anyone's place." But the room didn't listen. The response wouldn't come in words. Instead, he felt the change begin to happen within himself. His very identity, his essence, seemed to be fragmenting, whatever was happening to him. It was like a macabre metamorphosis, a transformation imposed by an invisible yet undeniable force. Lucas's body began to feel strange. His limbs grew heavy, his skin cold and stiff. He tried to scream, but his voice was muffled, as if something were blocking his throat. He tried to move, but his feet stayed rooted to the spot, as if the floor had glued itself to him. The other students around him began to approach, their figures blurred, as if they were somewhere between the present and the future. The girl, her expression now a mix of pity and satisfaction, looked directly into Lucas's eyes, as if witnessing the final stage of his transformation. "Now, Lucas, now you'll understand what it means to be part of us." He felt as though he was being torn apart from within, as if his very soul were being ripped from his body. He no longer knew where he ended and where he began. His body, now pale and lifeless, no longer responded to his commands. His thoughts, once clear, were clouded, and he felt as though he was losing control. The room became a full nightmare. The shadows of the other students stretched toward him. Their hands began to touch his skin, as if they were stripping away everything that was left of him. But Lucas could no longer fight. He was being absorbed, taken by something he couldn't comprehend. Then, in the last moment, before being swallowed by the darkness, Lucas understood. He was already part of that eternal cycle. He had taken someone's place, not physically but spiritually. He was now part of the limbo, a soul condemned to remain in that room forever, waiting for another unwitting soul to take his place. What was left of Lucas was no longer an ordinary student, but a lost shadow, a soul now wandering aimlessly among the other souls that had been consumed by the room. He watched, unable to interact, as new victims arrived, confused and terrified, just as he once had been. The cycle never stopped. With each new student, the mystery renewed, and the classroom 404 remained unchanged, waiting for another to replace those already trapped within it. The other students, now part of the same fate, watched the new victims with vacant stares, as distant as Lucas now felt. They could no longer escape, just as he could not. They were all trapped there waiting, hoping someone else would take their place, perpetuating the curse of the room. The echo of ancient voices could still be heard, resonating through the room, murmuring to the new souls, inviting them to make the same mistake, to enter the game that would imprison them forever. And Lucas, in his new state, felt a deep sorrow, not for himself, but for the victims who were about to make the same choice he had made. He tried, unsuccessfully, to warn them, but his voice was now only a whisper, lost among the silent screams of the trapped souls. With each new cycle, Lucas's face faded a little more, becoming a distant memory. He no longer remembered who he had been, but deep within his essence, he felt the anguish of a young man who had been swallowed by curiosity and fear, condemned to an endless existence in a place where time stood still. And the room? It remained intact, ready to receive the next victim, hungry for more souls to feed the eternal cycle. Because, in the end, Classroom 404 never went out, and no one ever left.